I had this job in college. I was basically a telemarketer for the university. I'd come into a dimly lit admissions office in the evenings and I'd have this giant list of phone numbers and names of incoming students, and I'd get to call these kids and talk to them about my university. It was an okay job, but I'd often get through my list kind of quickly, and then I'd just sort of sit there secretly reading. I'd try not to get caught. I have this vivid memory of reading at least 3 books during one semester of wasting time at that job. Don't ask me what my GPA was that semester because none of these books were the ones I actually should have been reading. All of these books that I was just devouring at the back table of the admissions office while my boss wasn't looking, they were either by or about His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. I became so enthralled with the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. But I didn't have anybody to talk to about it. My friends didn't really want to have conversations about Buddhist tradition and philosophy. And this was before social media, so I couldn't just go online and find experts like you can do now. So that part of my faith just kind of dried up on the vine. I wish I'd had somebody like today's guest to help me explore it more. Hey, I'm really glad you are here. I'm so glad you're listening today. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Between Podcast. This is your host, Matt Matson, and I am so excited to introduce today's guest. Reverend Nathan Albert is a professional actor turned university chaplain, and there are probably some other stops along the way, but I like that story. He's at the University of Lynchburg, and he does a lot of interfaith work within that context. He's an author, and he's a religious pluralist. Years ago, he had a blog post go viral because of a man in his underpants, and that story later turned into a book called Embracing Love. And we'll get to all that here in a minute. But Nathan is a disruptor, an educator, a meditator, a lover of cities, a plant-based eater, and a passionate defender of the Oxford comma. Nathan, thanks so much for being here. And can I start by asking you to offer your tightest 60-second argument for the use of the Oxford comma? Go.
Well, thanks, Matt, so much for having me. I do love the Oxford comma. I think it clarifies everything. And it also, because we're both on Threads, a new social media platform, it'll get some traction on there. So
Yeah.
if you're looking for some good people to connect with, talk about the Oxford comma and you'll find your people. But
That may have been
that
how
might
we
be
first connected, actually.
probably.
And it was the most liked post and the most controversial subject of
I know
conversation.
people have strong feelings about it, but I got to use it. It's the right way. It's the right way. It's the only way, I should say.
That's right. Hey,
Uh,
let's dive into this right away. And I'd like
sure.
to ground our conversation in the story at the center of your book, Embracing Love. I referenced earlier a man in his underpants, but I want to let you tell this story. And I think this story is from back in 2010 or something, but it led to this viral blog post. It led to the book. And it's an important story, I think, not just in your own life, but in the lives of the millions of people who have come across this story one way or another over the years. Now, I'll just get out of the way for a second and let you tell that story from the beginning, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like it's a world of, I mean, just ages ago
Mm.
from when this all happened, but it does pop up every once in a while. Back in 2008, 2007, I was working and partnering and volunteering and eventually on staff with an organization who did a lot of work to build bridges between the LGBTQ community and religious communities, mostly churches, evangelical churches. And at the time, our offices were in Boys Town, which is a gay neighborhood in Chicago. And we would always attend the gay pride parade. And this parade, I mean, it's massive. I think the last few years, there's been like 1.5 million people in attendance and, snakes through Chicago about 3 miles. And right at the end of the parade route, there's usually been kind of these anti-gay protesters, and they had megaphones, big signs, pretty homophobic, toxic, harmful things for the whole parade, the hours that they were there. And so a handful of us got together and said, well, what if we were some sort of alternative Christian voice at this event? And the idea came up to do kind of, what if we just staked out at the parade, enjoyed it, and made signs that said things like, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the way the church has treated you. I'm sorry for how Christians have treated you. I think one said, I used to be a Bible banging homophobe. I'm sorry. And we made shirts that said, I'm sorry. And we had maybe 30, 40 people. We lined up at the parade and just kind of enjoyed it. Um, about halfway through the parade, what ended up happening was a gentleman was on top of his float. He was in his white underwear, abs of steel, looking great up there, dancing away. And he kind of looked down at us and yelled from the top of the float, what are you sorry for? Because he saw our signs or saw our shirts maybe. And so I pointed at a couple of the signs. He was far enough away. And he ended up jumping down off of the float and ran over and just hugged a group of us. And at that exact moment, a photographer took a picture, sent that to us as an organization, and I kind of just wrote a blog post about that experience. At the time, my blog had like 4 readers. I mean, this was, 2010, right?
Yeah.
This was when blogs were popular. I think it was on blogspot.com. I mean, just like horrible social media back then. And so, the 4 readers read it, and somehow it got picked up. And a couple other people had posted about it. Rachel Held Evans did
Mm.
a big blog post about it. It got picked up by the BBC. It was an image on, I think, BuzzFeed's top, I don't know, pictures that will restore your faith in humanity blog post. People from members of NSYNC to other Hollywood stars were reposting it. And I think it just became a different way to think about how you can care for those who have been hurt.
Mm.
That did eventually, at the same time, I was writing my master's dissertation or thesis on kind of how churches have talked about LGBTQ issues, studying the clobber passages that are often used and looking at different interpretations of that. And then eventually, kind of a mix between that blog post and those stories, my experience as an actor, being kind of immersed in the artist world, and that thesis became kind of a culmination into a book called Embracing Love. There is a subtitle, My Journey to Hugging a Man in His Underwear, because there is another book called Embracing Love that I think is like some sort of graphic novel out there. But yeah, so that's kind of that. I think looking back on the book, my hope was to really help kind of the Christian world have different conversations about this, to look at kind of the breadth of interpretation of the Bible, to give a history of the LGBT community, to hear stories about queer individuals, and just put all that in one resource. I think now I'd probably rewrite the whole thing, and I think I would probably point more people, if they were interested, to go read queer authors instead.
Yeah.
But I think at the time it was helpful for a lot of people who were maybe just starting this conversation of, oh, I think I'm a Christian who was conservative, and maybe I'm becoming a little more progressive or open on some views. What are my next steps, or how do I go about that? And so that, I think, there were some helpful resources in the back and kind of suggestions towards the end of the book on how do we engage in these conversations? How do we care for people better? And how do our churches become more inclusive and welcoming, and not just churches that have signs that say all are welcome, but really they aren't? So I think that's kind of, I guess, the summary I could say.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all of that story. And it's funny, maybe it's not funny. Funny is definitely not the right word, because in the meantime, because it's only been until recently that this conversation, I mean, this, you wrote your book in like, not like 2016 or something. The story happened in
True.
2010, right? Like this hasn't been that long ago, but also a vibrant, widely public conversation about LGBTQ affirmation and celebration within Christian spaces hasn't really been happening for that long.
No.
I actually, when I read your book, I really did. I flipped back to when was this published? Because I wanted to sit in my memory of my understanding of the Christian community at that time. And I couldn't help but then see that book as you being a good pastor to people who wanted to be accepting, wanted to be loving, wanted to be open, but didn't feel like they could or felt almost trapped inside uh, sort of this cage of what maybe a conservative Christian world had taught them to
Hmm.
be in at that
Hmm.
time. And I thought it was gentle and I thought it was sweet in that approach, a wonderful pastoral book, kind of for folks who felt trapped in that world and wondered, how do I accept people that I, for so all of my life, I've been told not to accept?
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's really good to hear. And I think that was kind of my heart in that book. I think there were a lot of books that I had read that were it's this way or the highway, or
Yeah.
you have to be conservative and orthodox. And I wanted to be that middle way, but I think looking back now, I didn't want to. I don't think the middle voice is as it should be. I want people to be a little more inclusive and progressive. So
Yeah.
my argument I think would change, but I
Yeah.
think um, that's kind of you know I sat with a lot of individuals, and my role at the time was pastoring individuals who were gay, who were married in a heterosexual marriage, and then eventually came out and were questioning: Do I divorce? Do I live this lie? Do I go back in the closet?
Hmm.
Or I've been a pastor for my whole life, and now I'm coming out. What do I do? Can I stay in this church?
Yeah.
To parents, I mean, I have a whole section in the book about how do you parent your parent through this process.
Wow.
Those who are older and very conservative and have gay children and are realizing, oh, what I thought abstractly about these topics is not what I see in my kid.
Yeah.
And so my abstract theology has to change
Yeah.
in order to care for my child. And I think that has been what I've seen and kind of I wanted to get the conversation around because when you can't argue with people's stories and experiences,
Mm.
and once you know people and experience people, see the divine in them, your theologies should and will change,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's people centered rather than theologically
Yeah.
focused, right?
Hey, I wasn't planning on asking you about your professional acting career, but I'm this has me thinking, maybe I wonder if your comfort level of diving into the sidelines of the Pride Parade in Boys Town, Chicago, with a big shirt on and a big sign that says, "We're Christian and we're sorry." I wonder if there's a comfort that you learned from being an actor about living in the very uncomfortable middle space, in the
Mm,
very complicated human reality of a wide range of emotions existing at the same time. To show up in a difficult place and say, I'm sorry loudly is not a normal behavior, right? That is, there's a reason that blog went viral. This is outside of our ordinary life. But I feel like, I don't know if this resonates with you at all, acting allows us to live in the middle of that, both of those
mm,
masks of the old ancient Greek symbol
mm,
of right tragedy and comedy, and we wear them both at the same time
mm.
in theater. I'm curious. I'm speaking a little outside my
No,
depth there, but I'm curious about
yeah,
it.
that's a great point. I will say the musical theater world that I was immersed in, worked professionally for a long time in, it it gave me insight into the broader queer community. I mean, there were
Mhm.
times where I was the only heterosexual straight dude in a show,
Yeah.
right? And so like I actually have I have a picture somewhere of when I did South Pacific, and there's
Mhm.
this, half of us are shirtless and we're all Navy people, and there's some song about living about what is it called? About uh, we're all singing about dames, all women,
Yeah.
right? Like how
Yeah.
much we miss dames.
Yeah.
Um, and I have this picture of all of us, and it looks great. And I think like 90, 80% of the men in there would not sing those lyrics to
Yeah.
a dame,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But that gave me, I think, a lot of insight where the majority of my friends um, either grew up in a Christian environment,
Mhm.
and when they came out, either were kicked out of their families,
Mhm.
had serious religious trauma, and or were shunned by family members, church communities, and so came into this world completely wounded um, by the by people who are professing that they're going to love all people. So I
Yeah.
think that seeing that again and again and again and again, it wasn't just this is a one-time experience. The whole system is harming an entire people group.
Hmm.
And that became very clear in all of my friendships and relationships. And like you say, I do think the acting world, you're so immersed in your emotions. You're
Hmm.
so raw. You're like part of your job is to take a written script and to make it emote it and make it real. So I think there is this um, aspect of taking there's I think actors and artists are so in tune with their emotions and feelings that they express in a way that many of us don't usually do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Hey, so I'd love to have you talk about your own faith journey for a little bit. I sense that
sure.
it's been maybe a road of maturing in your own faith over the years. I know I read in one of your bios that I found online that it says you're trying to be religiously interreligious or religious
Mm,
interreligiously. Maybe let me say it that way: religious
yeah,
interreligiously. I really like that phrase. I wondered if you would walk us down your road of faith a little bit and
sure.
maybe name some of the big turns and detours you've taken along the
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could summarize it, I would say I've been on a spiritually expansive journey.
Hmm.
And I think that's some newer language that I'm using, but has been really freeing. I grew up pretty conservative Christian. My family was split between uh, two sides of Lutheranism, right? So Missouri Synod Lutherans and ELCA Lutherans, the very conservative and the more progressive groups. And we got along at every family gathering. And so grew up pretty conservative, attended like a Baptist youth group throughout junior or elementary or high school, college. And eventually working professionally, moving all over the country, I kind of just started exploring different congregations, Christian congregations, from Pentecostal churches to mega churches to small rural little Lutheran churches where wherever I was living, I just kind of would show up. And that gave me a great appreciation for the diversity within Christianity,
Yeah.
right? So an Orthodox church, an Episcopalian church, a mega church, these are all just so different. And it really taught me like I think I grew up with this idea of like my way is the right way and all those other congregations are wrong. And what I ended up kind of shifting to was we're all a diamond and we all are different facets of this. And
Mm.
yeah, we all have different flaws, but we all can shine really brightly. Um, and that got me through graduate school and seminary and eventually working for a congregation. But I'd say in the last um, handful of years that, moved to a more progressive, became much more progressive or liberal or whatever you want to say, focused on um, social justice and liberation, became a key focus. But in the past few years, I would say I've been really drawn to Buddhist sutras and meditation. And I think my Christianity has led me to explore Buddhism in a way that I wouldn't before.
Mm.
And Buddhism is drawing me to understand Christianity in a way that I didn't before. So probably the last few years, I've been really drawn to Thich Nhat Hanh and the Plum Village tradition, Zen Buddhism, and for my own personal, it's actually helped me not only with meditation, but the idea of liberation and freedom. Um, I've been really drawn to ideas of impermanence and interbeing,
Mm.
um, these notions that everything is changing all the time and that everything is interconnected and what affects all or one affects everything. And it's really helped with grief as well.
Mm.
My mother died about a little over a year ago. And I think Buddhism speaks so much of death and grief and
Mm.
suffering,
Yeah.
and that actually on the other side of suffering is joy and appreciation and gratitude.
Mm.
And that has been kind of my grief journey as well. So I think it's helped me understand grief in a way that for a long time Christianity didn't have the answers for
Yeah.
me with grief and suffering. Um, so yeah, so I continue to say I'm kind of spiritually expansive. I'm drawn to this. And I would say, I think more and more people are becoming spiritually fluid or multiple religiously, or
Yeah.
religiously multiple, you could say, and are drawing from different traditions or ideas. And I think a lot of the context that I'm in now versus when I was in a church, for instance, working as a pastor, my job was really to help Christians become fuller Christians.
Mm.
And a lot of my work now is not just helping Christians, it's learning about Hindus and Buddhists and atheists and humanists and Jews and Muslims. And so caring for them spiritually has allowed me to do has allowed me to reflect on my own spirituality. And so I've realized my spirituality becomes fuller and better learning from and learning with those of other traditions. So
Yeah.
that idea of being religious interreligiously, that comes from Paul Nitter and some others who are that do a lot of work on theologies of religion, and as well as kind of multiple religious belonging. This idea that we have to live our life religiously, but we do it interreligiously. We do it
Mm.
with those who have a different religious location and landscape than us. And so, if you're a Christian or a Buddhist, your Buddhism can become fuller by
Yeah.
learning from your Muslim neighbors, and your
Yes.
your Muslim faith becomes fuller and bigger when you learn from your Buddhist neighbors. And I just see that to be really true. And I
Yes.
think that is kind of this notion of religious diversity and religious pluralism is incredibly refreshing, and I think brings people together more than really pushes people apart.
Yeah. I don't want to make this about me, but I'm going to make this about me for a second, Nathan,
It's
because
your podcast,
yeah,
Matt.
that I guess you're right. That resonated with me so much. The idea that uh, extra religious experiences can deepen your own religious experience. Uh,
Yeah.
I think about, growing up. I often say I grew up vanilla Methodist. I was bored by the Methodist church. They were perfectly polite, and I was not ensorcelled in any way by what I experienced there, and really just was kind of faithless, spiritually
Hmm.
curious, probably as a teenager, but never had any context in which I could really enrich that or nurture it. In college, this is pretty cliche, but I encountered Buddhism for the first time in college in some cool class that I took, and started reading books by the Dalai Lama. And, it's
Yeah.
probably about the same time that 7 Years in Tibet came out, and Brad Pitt was my spiritual leader on accident. And, uh, but I became really curious about Buddhism, and kind of, I'd say that's right. I was really curious about Buddhism. I'm not sure I
Hmm.
would ever have qualified as a Buddhist in my own right, or in
Sure.
anybody else's, but I was really curious for a long time. And then, post college, encountered Unitarian Universalism, and
Yeah.
later on, sort of found my way back to an ecumenical Christian community that sung to my soul at
Hmm.
that season of my life. And what I found is that the deeper I dive into my own Christian faith of the moment, the more my past encounters with Buddhism or my current encounters with any faith tradition enrich the way that I read and understand and reflect on the Christian tradition that I'm
Yeah.
currently, sort of really feeling soaking in at the moment.
Yeah.
And I can't help but have that feeling over and over, like, oh, that's a surprising reading of
Hmm.
this New Testament text. That's
Hmm.
Eastern. This feels like Buddhist stuff. This feels like this Hindu story that I read the other day. Right? There's the
Yeah.
amount of that happens is really a beautiful thing. You're a university chaplain. I gotta believe you're encountering that, and at a university that is growing in its diversity, in the faith that are represented there. Will you tell me a
Hmm.
little bit? Tell me about that job of a university chaplain. Maybe tell us stories about what, like, real life
Yeah.
encounters with college students in your work with as a university chaplain are like.
Yeah. Absolutely. So my role is that university chaplain. I oversee our spiritual life center, and so kind of what a chaplain does. Oftentimes, we're journeying with people as they explore the spiritual, the ethical, meaning-making dimensions of life, the grief. We get to be people with other people who are trying to be more fully human, or I
Mm.
was going to say fully people.
Mhm.
Um, But yeah, we get to just be with students and faculty and staff. Our office, oversees things like spiritual life groups. So we have 14 different spiritual life groups, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, humanist, a queer and spiritual group. These are student groups that meet every week for either prayer or connection.
Mhm.
We do different services on campus. Sometimes that's a vigil for a student who has died. Sometimes that's a celebration for Ash Wednesday or an Easter celebration or Diwali celebration, Yom HaShoah, all those, types of services and events. We really focus on religious diversity. So, we're not under the diversity, DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion, very popular in so many companies and businesses and institutions. And our office is really speaking about religious diversity, right? So, are we aware of these dominant religious systems on campus and how that affects people? We do a lot of spiritual care, so meeting one on one with individuals um, just to listen. I often say part of my job is to be a bowl, and I have 10 bowls that I can see in my office. There's a few behind me.
Yeah.
But I love and a lot of them are singing bowls, but I often think my role is to be a bowl. And I tell this to students that they can come to our office and there's a lot that is swirling around in our heads. It could be anxiety, it could be stress, it could be deep questions about who am I or what am I supposed to do and what's post college life going to look like. And it's all swirling around and they need someone to hold that. And so we as chaplains are kind of the bowl for people
Yeah.
and you can come and spew it all in the bowl and we hold it. We don't
Mm.
spill it. We don't splash it. We don't share that bowl with others. We're one of the only completely confidential spaces on campus, and we
Mhm.
hold that bowl. And as a way to say what you are experiencing and speaking and sharing is sacred, and we'll hold that in this sacred bowl, and we'll put it on the shelf, and it can contain there. You might be able to feel a little lighter, a little freer, without that swirling around. And you can come back and I'll take the bowl off the shelf and we'll fill it up again. So a lot of our work is not necessarily giving advice. We're not counselors, but we do a lot of listening. We do a lot of advocating. We do a lot of disrupting, and we do a lot of listening to where students and faculty and staff are. Yeah, and I think that it's been a fun conversation. We were kind of chatting before we got started, but
Yeah.
a lot of my work, even today, we have a brand new group of students coming in. We have this past year a bunch of Hindu students from Nepal, Buddhist and Muslim students, international students as well. So, just the religious demographics are changing. We're predominantly a Christian institution, or I would say most of our students are Christian or have some affiliation with Christianity. But we see that changing. And so, how do we respond to that? How do we advocate for that? How do we make sure we have prayer spaces on campus for our Muslim students? How do we make sure our Hindu students who don't eat beef or certain root vegetables,
Yeah.
making sure they can have plenty of food in the cafeteria? What academic policies, like the academic calendar, interfere with certain religious holidays? So, raising awareness about that is a lot of the work we're doing. And we get like we say, we tell our students this all the time, but we have kind of an interfaith group that meets regularly, and we always tell them like the reason we're bringing you all together is not to debate, is not to convert you to someone else's opinion. We
Yeah.
want you to be a more fuller you. If you're a Christian, we want you to be a more fuller Christian. And one of the ways we do that is you learn from your
Yeah.
fellow Buddhist students
Yeah.
and Muslim students. And um, so that kind of interreligious work. And I use interreligious more than interfaith. I think interfaith often, more often than not, really centers on Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Mm.
And so interreligious, I think, allows some space for spiritual but not religious students, humanists, maybe those who are evolving in their
Yeah.
spirituality. And one of the things I love is we're called the Spiritual Life Center rather than a religious life center. And I've really loved a definition of spirituality by a theologian, Emmanuel Larty, who talks about spirituality as the flourishing of relationship within 5 dimensions. And I had a sixth to it, but he says that the flourishing of relationship with the transcendent, so a God figure, if that's for you, or ultimate reality, a flourishing relationship with yourself, with others, with a community, with places or things, and then because I'm a vegan, I will add with animals,
Yeah.
and or even in Buddhist traditions, they talk about plants and minerals, right?
Mhm.
Um, so all of those are spiritual relationships,
Oh,
right? And I've really appreciated that. Because I think a lot of religious teachings talk about you and God, right? Like this vertical dimension, or
mhm,
you or others is horizontal. But what about you and yourself? What about
mhm,
you and the place where you live, right? Like
mhm.
I live on Monacan land. And so owning a home for the first time on Monacan land has changed how I thought about the land on which I live,
Mm.
because I purchased it, but it's not my own.
Yeah.
And it comes from a long history of people that this land was taken from. So that place is different. Like things that have meaning, animals. How am I relating to animals in a way that is flourishing?
Yeah.
Um, and that's big, right? Like, because I don't like spiders and I want to smash all of them. But like, right? Like, what
Yeah.
about your spiritual life? Or right, like even Buddhist teachings,
Yeah.
or Hindu teachings, you do not kill anything. That includes plants and small animals or small bugs that look like they should be
Yeah.
stomped on. You don't do that.
Yeah.
You protect that life. And so all of those six areas has been a really fascinating thing. And I think that helps with students, right? Who are not as religious as they used to be, don't affiliate to a particular denomination, but they can see there's something sacred about their relationships with others,
Yeah.
or there's something sacred about their relationships with themselves,
Yeah.
and how do they flourish as humans in this day and age. Um, Flourishing with the transcendent. For many, that could be God, or that could be just ultimate reality. That could just be the spiritual vibe that they're feeling in
Mhm.
nature. So I think that helps engage students in a way that, or maybe even a younger generation that no longer is being tied to religious denominations or particular tradition, but are still asking spiritual questions that aren't necessarily tied to a particular religion,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
It does, and it makes me wonder about your sense. In a moment, I think I want to ask you, like, is this generation less spiritual than generations past? I can't help though but think, man, I wish I had had a relationship with the chaplain at my college when I was a
Mm,
student. I remember, my freshman year. My roommate freshman year is a wonderful guy and has this beautiful family now. And I remember these late night conversations I would have with him. His name was
mm,
Jonathan. And again, I wasn't really connected with my spirituality at all, but I know I was curious. In fact, I remember freshman year I read the Celestine Prophecy. You remember that
mm,
book? Do you know, was that
hmm
James Redfield? I don't know, but man, that book blew my mind. And so I was maybe more and more spiritually curious. But Jonathan, my roommate freshman year, was a Seventh Day Adventist, and
Yeah.
that was a really important faith tradition for him. And
hmm
I just remember like these late night conversations. I'd be up on the top bunk, he'd be down on the bottom, and we'd talk all night long about all these big things of life. And I wish I had had somebody to go to on
Mm,
campus and say, "Can I put this in your bowl and will you hold it for me? Because I
yeah.
don't know how to make sense of this, but it feels important. I want to make meaning. I want to make
Yeah.
meaning. I'm desperate for meaning. I think as a college student, I was. And
hmm
I didn't have anybody to hold that bowl or to help me stir it or to help me just look at it. I
Yeah.
think it just sort of cemented inside me. But I'm curious, do you think today's college students are losing their spirituality? Is it a less and less spiritual world or the opposite? I don't know.
I'm probably going to have a biased opinion on this, but I don't think they're less spiritual. I think um they're spiritual, but they're not naming it as such.
Mm,
And I think a lot of students don't want to be known as religious and spiritual at all, but are asking those spiritual questions. Right? There's that famous quote by someone who's brilliant, and I don't recall who it says, but we're not human beings trying to be spiritual. We're spiritual beings trying to be human.
mhm,
And so I think innately I believe that as humans, we're trying to, or we're spiritual beings trying to live as fully human as we can. And so
Yeah.
all of these things are spiritual conversations, meaning making conversations, these deep questions. These are all spiritual things. But I think a lot of students are identifying less with religious traditions because they've seen religious hypocrisy. They've
Yeah.
seen the misuse of religious power, and religious privilege. They've seen how politics and branches of Christianity have been used to oppress and marginalize people in our country. Um, and so to align oneself with a denomination and a political party and a certain theological belief or really ideology does not work. And I also think, I mean, maybe you were this way in college, but Sunday mornings, like
Yeah. Hard no.
the
Yeah.
last thing I want to do is, I mean, still even today, like I love my weekends. So like they're busy and overworked. So exploring some of these like churches or spiritual communities is on the back burner because there's enough going on in the world.
Mhm.
But even, you know, conversations on anxiety and stress and climate change. And these are all things that I think have a spiritual nature to them that students are really asking. I think they're much more, um, they see hypocrisy and BS from miles away. And so they're not buying a lot of
Yeah.
religious slogans and cliches. I think they're much more focused on activism, and
Mhm.
that if your faith is not causing you to work for the common good of people, then that faith is not one to really focus on. So maybe that means they're less spiritual or less religious. And I think that, there's research and statistics that are saying religious demographics on college campuses are changing and
Yep.
students are less religious and there's more nuns and spiritual but not religious. But I think that's more a sign of the failure of religious institutions more than I think that there are spiritual practices or spiritual rhythms or experiences that students are having on a
Yeah.
campus.
Yeah. That's a helpful conversation. Uh, my concern, I think, is you said, you know, I sense a lot of students don't want to be known as religious, don't want to be
Hmm.
associated with the baggage that they now can see. I mean, they just pull up their phone and they scroll through
Yeah.
whatever social media and they can see stories and stories and stories of, it's not like there's one bad news story that came out in the New York Times that maybe they read. No, it is the
Constant.
truth is everywhere about the darker side of religious
Hmm.
institutions.
Hmm.
And, my biggest concern, I think, as somebody who cares about people's spiritual health, is that the only option that people see is to associate themselves with a specific religious tradition or to have a church or to have
Hmm.
a faith label that they carry around with them. And there aren't many spaces, I think, outside of a college chaplain's office. There aren't a whole lot of spaces where people can just explore faith in a safe way without the weight of the labels, without the
Yeah.
baggage of past generations' mistakes and structural,
Yep.
abuse and trauma. Anyway, that
Yeah.
stuff that makes me worry genuinely for this
Hmm.
generation because I know that they're spiritual. Absolutely, they are spiritual beings, and they're going to long for it at some point. Uh, and I don't blame them for wanting to stay away from
Hmm.
things that have been so hurtful and painful.
Hmm.
And that's a really difficult. That's a difficult bridge to build.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you're working on a doctorate right now, is that right?
I am. Yes, in
Uh,
interreligious chaplaincy.
oh, all right.
I'm
So
almost done. I'm so close.
so close. I feel like that's the story of everybody who's working so close. And that last part is not an easy
Mm.
part of the hill to climb. I think I read in a social media post that you're researching ways to disrupt Christian hegemony. That sounds cool. So let's nerd out for a moment. Teach me
Sure.
what you're researching, why you're
Yeah.
researching it, what you think you'll find, what does it mean to disrupt Christian hegemony, and
Yeah.
how do people do it?
Yeah. So I'm looking specifically. One thing I found with a doctor, you got to like narrow it really,
Yeah.
really filter it. So I'm looking at my research has been on the ways chaplains, specifically in higher education, work to disrupt Christian hegemony or decenter Christian hegemony on institutions of higher education.
Yeah.
So that has meant researching and interviewing a bunch of chaplains and the work they're doing on campuses. Um, and from that, um, kind of looking at how specifically chaplains are, I have kind of a fourfold approach to how chaplains function on campus. And the first is they're multifaceted theologians. They're disruptors of the dominant. They are champions for religious diversity, and then they are multiple religious participants.
Mm.
And so, a lot of institutions of higher ed were founded by usually or many by Christian denominations. That I mean, Yale,
Yeah.
Harvard, most liberal arts schools. There's some, in your history, there's some a Baptist group, a Disciples of Christ group, a Catholic institution, right? There's this tie to a religious denomination. And what happened is a lot of these institutions, right, this dominant religious system, which is Christianity, is embedded into the very systems and policies on that campus. And so as college religious demographics are changing, the these policies are harming and continuing to maintain inequalities and inequities between Christians and usually non-Christians. There's a critical theory out there that I've referenced a lot in my dissertation called the critical religious pluralism theory. And she argues basically that it's a critical theory that's looking at systems of higher education. And she argues that these systems are maintaining inequalities on college campuses and what can be done about that. And so as I've read that text, and my research, I said, well, I think chaplains are actually play a key role in dismantling this Christian hegemony and these
Mm.
policies and systems on campus that are actually causing such oppression and marginalization. Um, and so for me, this idea of, disrupting dominant systems, chaplains are often, sometimes through their physical embodiment, right? As a woman chaplain or as an interfaith chaplain or as a Buddhist chaplain at
Yeah.
a predominantly Christian institution, by their very presence, they are disrupting the dominant way that religion functions on that campus. They're disrupting through policies and through different events and through the way they pray and through language that they're not praying to Jesus or one particular God, but they're praying to the multitudes of religions that are out there.
Yeah.
They're multifaceted theologians, so they're drawing from different religious traditions, whether that's womanist and feminist theology or Black liberation theology or different religious traditions. They're drawing from these things because they need to be aware of them. They're often the ones educating campuses on the different religions that are on campus. And so in a dominant system, most people know Christianity. So you can, in a meeting, say, like, can I get an amen? Which
Yeah.
happens a lot, right? And that's just proof that the dominant system is Christianity. So what's the language being used? What are the religious holidays happening at this time of year? Yeah, we think of Easter and Christmas, or Ash Wednesday, maybe. But what about Diwali? What
Mhm.
about Shiva's birthday? What about Buddha's birthday? These are big celebrations around the world, and for many of our students, they're important religious festivals. And then champions for religious diversity. I think one of the biggest findings I found in my research is chaplains love religious diversity. That they actually are advocates and want to promote the benefit of religious diversity, that it's better to have more religions than just one.
Yeah.
That actually, as we kind of talked about earlier, you can become a fuller human by learning from other religious traditions
Yeah.
or have a greater appreciation of your own religion because you've learned about other religions. So this movement away from your religion is wrong or these religions aren't right and mine is, to actually all of these religions are
Yeah.
sacred and beautiful and bring fullness and goodness to the world, and I get to see that.
Yeah.
And then specifically chaplains, and this has been one of the joys of my role is we get to participate in all these different functions, right? So I was invited to participate when I first got hired here to a celebration for Buddha's birthday where you bathe the Buddha statue, right? And you do a couple mantras and meditations, and was welcomed into that, was invited into that, even though I didn't identify as a Buddhist, or being a part of a Diwali celebration for our Hindu students, or participating in Mass for our Catholic students. We're facilitating a lot of these events and these rituals. We may not be leading them, right? Like I'm not going to lead a Catholic Mass as a non-Catholic,
Yeah.
but to attend that and to see how that is gathering or gaining life for students, we get to do that. We
Yeah.
we have finances, right? Like we fund these things, right,
Yeah.
to make sure that they can happen. So, yeah, so that's kind of the research, and obviously as a chaplain, I think it's really important that our chaplains are in higher education. Um, I think it's really important, and I think too. I think with the changing religious demographics in our country, I think we will interact with more chaplains in the future than we
Mm.
will with pastors, right?
Yeah.
Like there's all those studies that say like pastors are like the least trusted
Yeah.
people, which is
Yep.
disheartening, right?
Yeah.
Like especially because I have an MDiv and
Hmm.
I have a reverend title, and
Yeah.
like that's super discouraging. Um, but at the same time, like chaplains are not just in hospitals and
Mm.
prisons. They're on university campuses. They're in meatpacking industries. They're in workplace environments. They're, in much of Europe, they're in regular working industries, and they're helping
Mm.
people through some of these ethical questions or spiritual questions, or as we talked about earlier, just a place to process
Yeah.
life and the difficulties of work and marriage and family and education and global warming and all
Yeah.
these things that are weighing heavy on people. Um, so I really think chaplains have this unique ability to disrupt and to help heal. And so for me, like um, I'm all about disrupting Christianity because I think it's right. Like when it becomes tied to institutions and policies and becomes normative and there's Christian privilege that causes oppression. So what
Yeah.
what can we do in our context wherever we find ourselves to disrupt that so that other people can belong, so that other people can be seen, so other people can be valued,
Yeah.
other people can be themselves more fully,
Yeah.
rather than having to hide under the weight of the dominant system.
And I got a bunch of thoughts. I'll say two of them right now. One is that I think at the very least, a chaplain's presence on a college campus or in a meatpacking plant or in the military is a vital recognition of the fact that we have spiritual lives.
Hmm.
And you know, I think it probably there's a story to tell about how giant your chaplaincy department probably is there at Lynchburg. It's probably you probably got 45 people in your department that
I
are all
wish.
chaplains with you. Right. Obviously not. And how is it that, at the very least, there's some tiny recognition in American society that we do have a spiritual life. We've got this one
Hmm.
guy on campus who you can talk to. And I think that tells a story of this big separation, this big chasm that is between our real lives, our real longings and
Hmm.
existences, and the way society is built,
Yeah.
and how there's just so few places where you can go and somebody will hold a bowl for you
Yeah.
and you can explore your spirituality. My other
Yeah.
thought is related to being a disruptor of Christian hegemony, specifically within higher education spaces. I think about it. I went to a public school. I went to a state college. I went to Grand Valley State University in Michigan, and it's in near Grand Rapids on the west side of Michigan. And if anybody knows that area, they know that Calvin College is just down the
Yeah.
road, and
Right.
Cornerstone College is just down the road. Some of these very conservative Christian institutions. And most of the money in the Grand Rapids area, most of the people who have wealth are people who also have significant influence in
Mm.
conservative Christian spaces. And
Mm.
I think back to who all the buildings were named after at my public institution. DeVos and Van Andel and these really big named Calvinist influencers in
Sure.
the area. And I'm grateful for their contribution to my education. And I also noticed how at my public institution, uh, how conservative and Christian and white it
Yep.
was. And it's not hard to, I don't even say that critically of my institution. I had a wonderful experience, and I don't say that with any knowledge of anything, offhand, but gosh, you could feel it when you were a student. When I was a student there decades ago, I could feel it. And I can
Hmm.
imagine students from other faith traditions still feel that very
Yep.
much in much more acute ways than I ever did.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's maybe start to build an off ramp of our conversation here.
Sure.
Although I'm loving it, I'm guessing you're sitting in an office and there's books around you or books nearby, or there are books that you
Tons.
recommend to students who are maybe starting to explore their faith in new ways or want to expand their faith. They want to be more spiritually expansive. I'd love some recommendations from you
Mm,
for any books or podcasts or people to follow or anything like that that
sure.
maybe would help people understand the world in ways that you do.
Yeah. Some of my favorites, I would say I love Thich Nhat Hanh, right?
Mhm.
So Zen master, um, Buddhist monk. So any of his books, I've been actually all winter break, I've been reading his collection of Buddhist sutras, which is like a 500-page book. But some of my favorites of his is Zen and the Art of oh, what is it? Zen and the Art
Oh, I
of,
think I've got it here in my office someplace.
yeah,
I
I
can't
have it up
remember
there.
the end of it either.
Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet, I think. Yeah, Zen and the Art of
Yeah.
Saving the Planet. Uh, Living Buddha, Living Christ is another
Mhm.
great one. Um, I love James Baldwin. He's more uh, I feel like prophetic and social critic, but his collection of essays is one of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah.
James Cone on Black liberation theology, his books are great. I often tell students about I recommend Richard Rohr's The Universal Christ.
Mhm.
I think that gives such a unique perspective on religion and spirituality. So that's one that I've actually done some work with students on. Um, yeah, I think those would probably be some of my favorites. Yeah, I love Thomas Merton, Bell Hooks, especially The
Yeah.
Will to Change. That's a great book. I know she's, but that one in particular on patriarchy and men, I think is really, really important. Um, yeah, so those I think if I had to narrow it down, I love the Dhammapada, which is kind of it's a real short Buddhist sutras and text. Um, it's an easy read, but it's got a lot of how do we live in the here and now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
The
I probably have
Dhammapada.
I have shelves worth that I could keep
Yeah.
talking about too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I often am surprised by how accessible some Buddhist texts are. The Dhammapada is
totally.
a great example. Like it looks a little intimidating when you see it. Like maybe you're not used to reading things with Eastern culture covers,
Hmm.
and then you kind of dive into it, and you're like, oh, this is conversational and
Yeah.
playful and interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Accessible. Thanks, man. This has been great, Nathan.
No, thank you. I've loved
Uh,
it.
I'm so passionate about college students. I've spent my career working with college students, visiting hundreds of colleges and universities all over North America, and I know that moment of life, those
Hmm.
2 to 6 years that often, on average, students are experiencing this not just book knowledge experience. It is this
Yep.
growth experience. It is this permission to explore the world in a whole new way
Yep.
through eyes that they feel like they own for the first time. And goodness knows their spiritual lives could use somebody who could hold a bowl for them for a little
Mm.
while and just be a safe place to let their music sing inside that bowl. I love the work that you do. I think it is so important, and I feel like it's a job. A, not a lot of people know about. B, there aren't nearly enough of you out there doing this job, and we all could use, in just our. I'd like I'd like a chaplain for my cul-de-sac. I think we could use
I'm
that.
with
That'd
you.
be really nice.
We need some chaplains. And if you're interested, just as a plug, I sit on the board for the Association for Chaplaincy and Spiritual Life in Higher Education. And so we're um, a, a newer organization that was the combination of two different organizations that merged a few years ago. There's about 460 members, and so there are quite a bit of
Yeah.
chaplains in
Yeah.
higher education, right, that are doing a lot of this work, or trying to do this work as well as we can. And so there's some resources, and you can go to the website there, Google that name, but there's some great people. I've been
Yeah.
so it's just been so fulfilling to meet colleagues and others who are doing this work, at small institutions to
Yeah.
huge state schools. I'm with you. It's really good work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's an honor for sure.
Yeah. Hey, how can people find you if they want to connect with you more or read your book or whatever?
They can come take me out for coffee anytime they want. No, um,
Yeah.
I do love some coffee. My website is nathanelbert.com. There is like some blog on there that I haven't updated most recently. My socials, I've gone through like deleting a lot of them. I've
Mhm.
tried all of them from Mastodon and Twitter,
Mhm.
but then I've just narrowed them down. So most of the two that I'm on most right now are Instagram and Threads. My handle is nelbert or Nelbert. That's where I'm hanging out most of the time.
Yeah.
I'm no longer on Facebook. I deleted that. I'm no longer on the Twitter, as it used to be known in the good days. But those are the places where you can find me most regularly.
That's where I think you and I first encountered each other. And
Yeah,
I'm really glad we did. I keep one of the beautiful gifts of this podcast is that there's a lot of people that I've just only ever connected with on social media
exactly.
and just said, do you exist in A, do you exist in real life? B, if so, would you like to talk?
Yeah,
C, can we record it? Let's see what
that's right.
happens if we
Are you
record it.
not
So
a spam
that's
account?
right.
And
That's right.
can we
Uh,
chat?
yeah, that's right. Thanks, Nathan. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Hey, thanks to all you betweeners out there for listening to this episode of the Between Podcast. Make sure you visit between.church on the internet to sign up for our mailing list. That's probably the most important thing, our email list. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. You can check out our 5-minute sermons, 5-ish minute sermons that we post every week. Follow us on social media. We got daily prayers. We got all sorts of other content. And join our community fully. We invite everyone. You are welcome here, no matter who you are or where you're from, no matter what you believe or even if you believe, no matter who you love or how you love, no matter what anybody else has ever told you about you. You are welcome and loved and celebrated here at Between. My favorite church is the space between people. Now go with God's love and create the church between.